The term intensive farming is the only way to feed the world is or bandied around quite a lot. Could you just tell us a bit about that from your perspective?
I think I'm a conventional farmer, and I use agrochemicals and I use pesticides and fertilizers. So hopefully I use them responsibly. But so I guess I am what is termed an intensive farmer. But I think it's possibly more down to mindset than anything else. So that even while you're using pesticides and fertilizers, you can use them responsibly or you can use them irresponsibly. And I think so within those terms of intensive, there are shades, but is intensive the only way to feed the world? Obviously not, because the vast majority of the world is actually fed by non-intensive farmers in sort of less developed parts of the world. That is the way that they feed themselves. So no, I don't accept that argument at all. I think it's part of plugging us farmers into a system that supports an awful lot of chemical companies, fertilizer companies, and their salesmen.
Could you just go into a little bit more about your idea of the different definitions? So we hear the term mainstream, intensive, use conventional, and then there's organic and all sorts of alternative, I guess, approaches. Could you just give us a rough idea of how you see the differences between them?
Well, in terms of environmental impact, obviously the difference between organic and conventional farming is quite significant. But ultimately, I think there's not a lot of difference. As a farmer, my priority is to feed my family. And although I use chemicals, I'm an intensive farmer, I have no conflict or problem with an organic farmer who's merely trying to achieve the same thing. If we can both feed our families and coexist sympathetically with the flora and fauna that share our farm landscape with us, that's all to the better. So I don't actually see any conflict at all. It's about how farmers try to produce crops that are financially viable and hopefully environmentally sympathetic from their land. And as you experienced with the field of wheat, which is that thing just over my shoulder, that field there, on this land that I farm, the weed burden here is so great that organic farming is not necessarily an option. So if I became an organic farmer, I probably wouldn't be a very productive farmer. So it's down to it's down to this position sort of thing. You've got to make the best of what you are and where you are.
Could you just tell us a bit about, mainly the wheat that you grow, but also some of the other cereals?
Mm-hmm. Well, the wheat is on my farm is grown in rotation. I've recently started adopting a 6-year rotation. So wheat has 2 of the spots in that 6 years, but I also grow barley and oilseed rape. And we've been letting some land out to a local dairy farmer to grow maize on, to try and create another break, because it's around trying to increase the number of break crops and the diversity of cropping on the land to try and mitigate and reduce the impact of disease and pests, and in particular things like blackgrass, which is this grass weed that's developed recently that is pretty much tolerant to all herbicides, certainly all herbicides we can use in the growing crop. That's been a huge driver on my farm and the vast majority of farms towards adopting a far more sort of longer term rotation, which is all to the good, because I think I, along with most farmers, have been cutting our rotations far too tight with just rape and wheat, or indeed just continuous wheat, and have built up problems through doing that. There were good reasons for doing it, not least the bank manager and that unpleasant interview every year we all have with the bank manager. But I think we did it in the knowledge, if we're honest, that we were going to build up problems, and those problems are now here. So we're having to adapt fast to a situation. Interesting, a situation where there's no magic silver bullet available. There's no vaccine coming over the horizon for blackgrass, I'm afraid. So we've got to deal with it by good farming, good husbandry.
One of the aims of the Sheffield Wheat Experiment is to start the ball rolling to create a Sheffield sort of land race of wheat. And now we know that the term in itself, land race, sort of has different definitions according to who you're talking to. But the idea that the seed can evolve to adapt more beneficially to its environment. So with that in mind, could you talk a little bit about seed and the seed you grow and how that works for you?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating area, actually. I mean, most of us farmers in this country, we probably only grow about 5 varieties of wheat, most of which share common parentage, actually, because they accidentally found various beneficial traits, and those have been bred into the wheats we have now. So we are very, very vulnerable in terms of the genetic diversity of the wheats we grow. So the idea that going back in this country to a locally developed variety that is specific for our climate, topography, soils, and all the rest of it is fascinating. I mean, it's nothing new. If you go to India, every village seems to have its own land race, its own specific wheat. They vary enormously, but they are adapted to the needs in those areas. And there's even, I think there's one in the Indian, there's a variety in India that holds their wheat record that has something like a 12-inch panticle. So the ear is sort of 12 inches long, with about 3 times the number of sites, individual seeds on it, than we have on our wheats in this country. So when you start looking at the diversity that's there, it only makes sense, I think, to go towards developing seeds of this sort. Indeed, our grandfathers had landrace varieties, the great-grandfathers certainly. So and in many ways, I think it's something really important, because part of our problem, going back to the use of chemicals and fertilizers, is that our varieties are too intolerant of disease and pests. And yet those landrace varieties could well be developed that have the tolerances we need as farmers, and would not only mean that we could maintain yields, but we could significantly reduce the amount of pesticide and fertilizer we use, and therefore significantly reduce the impact we have on the environment. So my own thinking is actually that this is probably one of the main ways forward for farming in this country.
Could you talk a little bit about what it means for you to create resilience in the system that you use? So the idea is that, because you haven't got that diversity of seed and that population, you can't do it that way. But you talked about the different rotations and changing the types of rotations as maybe one way to kind of fight against disease. I mean, do you feel limited in kind of what you can do to do that, other than use the agrochemicals that you're kind of trying not to use too much?
Yeah, very limited actually. I have tried sowing 2 varieties of wheat in the one field together to try and use that as a sort of a hybrid effect to reduce the amount of disease in the field. But yes, I'm very, very limited in the tools that I have to try and mitigate the risk from disease and pest, and to change my farming systems to be more resilient. And I'm very aware that with climate change, we're going to see huge changes in farming in the range of pests and diseases that we've got in the fields. And I think there's also evidence that some of these landrace varieties, or indeed populations of wheats grown together, have the ability to adapt quite quickly to change. And that, I think, is a fascinating idea, that we could actually grow varieties that would adapt themselves to the needs of our particular farms, and therefore mitigate the risk going forward. I think that to me would be a significant step forward. The problem for that is that the minute we start developing landrace varieties, we start cutting out the large seed industry, because it doesn't suit their needs. And therefore we're going to have to find a way of adapting it so that they don't necessarily lose out, and they can find a way of supporting us. But at the moment, I mean, they only develop wheats really for, say, Northern Europe. Trying to come down, focus any tighter than something like an area like Northern Europe is not economic for them. So the idea we can develop one for Sheffield or Brass and Fen, where I farm, to them is a complete non-starter. But to us as individual growers, possibly quite very achievable.
If you could change things, if there maybe the financial profit wasn't an issue, but the land was how it was, what would you like to do? And I guess what I'm getting at is, what is the priorities for you?
Well, the reason I'm not organic is because of the weed burden. The weeds that grow in the fields, they're just too much for an organic system. But that doesn't mean I can't move towards an organic standard in terms of disease control and pest control in the crops. And that's something I'm trying to achieve. It is proving hard because the varieties I'm using are so intolerant to disease and pests. There's an assumption amongst the breeders that agrochemicals will always be available to control every disease. There'll be agrochemicals to control pests, and therefore there is no need to invest their time and money breeding varieties that are tolerant to disease and pests. But what we're seeing is a complete breakdown in our chemicals and their efficiency, or indeed they're being withdrawn from the market because they're having a negative effect on humans or other flora and non-target species, flora and fauna in the fields. So I think the way forward is definitely to have that resistance bred into the varieties of wheat that I'm sowing in the fields. And there are moves towards that at the moment within the plant breeding world, but not a massive impetus, because I don't think the sort of the immediate need is quite accepted by the majority of farmers in the way that I think it's absolutely necessary.
What does experimentation and innovation mean for you? And so in a sense, I think I'm getting to kind of what is farming and what is farming for you, and how's that challenged or changed?
Well, the experimentation and innovation in farming is an interesting area, because we've become so dependent on innovation as farmers over the last, certainly since the Second World War. And a lot of that innovation has actually been a fix for a problem that's already been created by innovation. So so for instance, blackgrass is very much a product of innovation, of the chemicals we've used that have allowed us to change our farming rotations and practices. But suddenly we get this problem that there is no techno fix for. And so we're having to go back to the old ways to try and address it. So I think that it's deciding which is the right kind of innovation as we move forward. For instance, we could use robotics in farming, and that's a modern innovation that I'm sure will be coming into farming very soon. But it's down to how we use it. I was recently working with a professor of robotics at the local university, and he was telling me you can send a robot into the field with a camera and some kind of machine to kill weeds or kill bugs in the field, and you could take out every weed in the field, and you can take out every bug in the field. And he seemed more than surprised when I said that's the last thing I want to see, because if I do that, then there's nothing in that field and to other than the crop I planted. So there's no weeds to provide habitat for the beneficial insects that would also populate that field and provide food for other animals in the food chain, as well as being predators to the insects I have in the field. So what I said to him is, I need a robot that can go through that field and take out weeds and take out bugs down to threshold levels, the sort of the economic level of damage. And therefore we could retain a whole ecosystem within the field, but it's not injurious to me as a farmer, because it's not damaging my yield and my income from the field. In fact, it might well be benefiting it, because then if we get the insects and things at the right level, I may well not need to have the robot go through a second time. And that would save me money. So it's how we use innovation. And what we've got to do is, it's about understanding what we want to achieve and giving clear instructions to the scientists, who can deliver a hell of a lot for us as farmers. But we've got to make sure that they understand what we actually need. And that can be far more complex than just taking out every aphid in the field.
And that makes me think about expertise, and maybe going back to that question around what is farming and how it's changed. So, you know, when you were talking then, I was thinking about that a lot more people have got involved in farming. So from the individual farmer's point of view, a lot of the responsibilities and roles and knowledge has been sort of shared or outsourced or kind of brought in. And I think that one of the things that we used to talk about was that, you know, there's sort of specialism in that expertise that is brought in, which is very much more advanced than you could deal with, but then at the same time it's sort of disconnected from the whole picture that you're dealing with. Does that sort of sound right? So like how do you balance that in terms of sort of a lot of the decisions or choices being taken elsewhere, but then you're the one that's kind of seeing the whole picture?
I think this is part of the problem, because ultimately, I guess the kind of question you're asking is, situation I was working on recently, farming can only move forward in terms of where the road is laid for us. So if we're talking about innovation and those specialisms that support farming, they've got to lay the road for us. And if that's not done, we can't move forward, not with any confidence. So there are a few pioneer farmers out there who do mad things, but they do take a huge financial risk in doing those things, and they're often not supported properly. And I think this is part of the problem. So much of our research and development in farming is directly funded by the industries that supply us, and they need to see a payback. Government has stepped back from this sort of blue sky thinking area of delivering, and in fact it's now government policy that every area of research should have added benefits, which essentially, to my mind, means selling me a bottle of some kind of chemical on the back of this development. So it is a huge problem for us in farming, and I think it is taking us up some blind alleys. It has taken up some blind alleys, which is the public have quite rightly criticised us for doing. I'm not sure it was actually our decision as farmers to make. It was probably made at political level and indeed boardroom level in some of the chemical houses and fertiliser houses. But but again, we need to engage more as farmers so that people do understand what's wanted on the farm.
Yeah, and I think you know, we talked about risk a lot when we did the field of wheat, and in a sense it feels like the margins are so tight and the time frame by which you work is so long, in a sense, that there's not a lot of movability, is there, to take those big risks where you can really shift kind of way that you farm, or without huge risks.
Farming is a risk business. We're dealing with the British weather to start with, and the British government. I mean, you can imagine two more factors in any business that can change minute to minute than those two. So somehow, against that background of incredible levels of risk, we're trying to manage businesses that support our families and hopefully grow and provide space for the environment and flora and fauna on our. But at the same time, bizarrely, although we're in a real risk business, farmers are very, very risk averse, and they've got to the point now where we've stopped managing risk, and we are just now avoiding risk. And this is one of the reasons why we are using so much agrochemical and fertilizer, and why we're so dependent on some of these high output seeds, is because we've become too risk averse. A recent study in France showed that the French farmers could actually stop using 74% of the chemicals they apply without actually reducing yield on a national basis. So we are actually now buying yield because we've become so risk averse as farmers, and it's a massive problem. And the trouble is, when you're so risk averse, then that moves into other areas. So, for instance, every farmer has had the opportunity to become an organic farmer and be supported by the government through the change process, which takes about 3 years. But even though that scheme has been in place for 30 odd years, only about 5% of farmers are organic farmers, and only about 5% of our land area in the UK is farmed organically. So, and it's purely, I think, down to risk aversion and trying to, not to the point where we manage risk, but where we just try and avoid it, actually. And I think that's dangerous, because that then cuts back towards innovation and being able to adapt and move forward and change our methods of production.
So in this ever slowly changing challenge of farming, what does success and failure look like to you?
That's a good one. I think well, success is being able to support my family, surviving that interview with the bank manager every year, so we can carry on for another year. That's part of it. Success can be big things like making a profit, and it can be little things like watching a tree grow that you plant. So it is all, seeing partridges return to the farm where there were no partridges here when I bought the farm. So it can be big things, it can be little things, and that's one of the beauties of farming. Actually, is it is an all-encompassing work. It's actually a lifestyle. I had a few years without a farm, and I know how privileged I am to be a farmer, and that being able to own land is a privilege. Being able to live and work on that land is a privilege. Being able to walk from one end of the field to the other without asking anyone's permission is a privilege. And it's a privilege that very few of us have in this country, and even fewer of us actually appreciate. And I think that's part of our problem. Farmers are far too negative. They, I know farmers are well known for whinging, but most farmers don't really understand how lucky they are to do the job they do. It does come with its stresses and problems. But I think one of our other problems is that in many ways, while we're talking about this, we've sort of become divorced from the public, which is why scheme projects like your wheat growing project and the Field of Wheat project are so important. Because essentially farmers and the public have been divorced. That had to be done by those with a vested interest, because they needed to create a chain, and every link in the chain is another middleman or another supplier. So if I sell my wheat direct to you and you grind it in your kitchen and put it in the oven, Tesco, Hovis, the whole lot just went bankrupt. We've completely buggered the British economy. Well, assuming it's not buggered anyway with Brexit, but so we have been divorced as consumers and farmers, to the point now where farmers drive around thinking the public don't care as long as it's cheap, which is obviously rubbish. They do care where it comes from and how it's produced, and they understand that cheap is not always best value. And conversely, the public think that farmers just drive around in Range Rovers, shout and get off my land on the way to the bank to cash a subsidy check, which also isn't true. Well, it might be in a few cases, but generally isn't true. So, and I think this is part of our problem. We've got to bring it back together, and that's why projects that bring the public onto farms and farmers into the public domain, into the wider public area, are so important.